Action-adventure fantasy. This genre combines elements of adventure with exciting, often fast-paced action. It typically features quests, exploration, and dynamic characters who face physical challenges and adversities. Magic, mythical creatures, and exotic locales are common, adding a fantastical twist to the traditional action-adventure narrative. Heroic fantasy. Heroic fantasy, also known as heroic epic, centers around heroes and their adventures. Often set in a world where magic is real and mythical creatures exist, these stories focus on the hero's journey, moral struggles, and battles against formidable antagonists or evil forces. Lost World fantasy. This genre involves the discovery of unknown lands, untouched by modern civilization, often featuring ancient species or civilizations. These stories play on the allure of exploration and the mystery of undiscovered territories, blending scientific exploration with fantastical elements. Subterranean fantasy. Set in mysterious underground worlds, this genre explores civilizations and ecosystems hidden beneath the Earth's surface. It often combines elements of exploration with ancient myths, featuring unique creatures and cultures developed in isolation from the surface world. Sword and Sandal fantasy. A genre that focuses on epic historical or mythical settings, emphasizing sword-wielding heroes, grand battles, and ancient mythologies. It often includes elements of romance and adventure, set in times reminiscent of the Greco-Roman era. Sword and sorcery fantasy. This subgenre combines sword-wielding action with sorcery. Stories often follow a sword-wielding hero who battles against supernatural adversaries. It emphasizes fast-paced action and personal combat rather than high fantasy's epic scale and complex political narratives. Wuxia. A Chinese genre blending martial arts adventure with fantastical elements. Wuxia stories often feature skilled warriors, honor-bound heroes, and elements of Chinese philosophy and mythology, set in an often anachronistic version of ancient China. Contemporary fantasy. This genre brings fantasy elements into a modern setting. Magic, mythical creatures, or supernatural phenomena are interwoven into the real world, creating a contrast between the fantastical and everyday life. Occult detective fiction. Combines the mystery and detective genres with the supernatural. The protagonist investigates mysteries involving ghosts, demons, curses, and other supernatural elements, often using both traditional detective skills and occult knowledge. Paranormal Romance. A romantic genre infused with supernatural elements. Stories typically focus on romantic relationships between humans and supernatural beings like vampires, werewolves, or angels, often exploring themes of forbidden love or the merging of different worlds. Urban fantasy. Set in urban environments, this genre mixes magical elements with the modern world. It often features contemporary characters interacting with mythical beings or magical occurrences in a city setting. Cozy fantasy. A subgenre focusing on lighter, more comfortable aspects of fantasy. It often features quaint settings, endearing characters, and a focus on community and belonging, rather than epic battles or dark themes. Dark fantasy. This genre combines elements of fantasy with darker themes and atmospheres. It often includes horror elements, moral ambiguity, and complex characters facing bleak or challenging situations. Fairy tale fantasy. Draws from traditional fairy tales, but with expanded narratives and deeper character development. These stories often reimagine classic tales, adding new twists or exploring the underlying themes in greater depth. Fantastique. A European genre, often blurring the lines between reality and fantasy. It involves a subtle intrusion of supernatural phenomena into the real world, creating a sense of uncanny mystery. Fantasy comedy. This genre combines elements of fantasy with humor. It often involves quirky, humorous takes on traditional fantasy tropes, with an emphasis on lighthearted and whimsical storytelling. Fantasy of manners. Focuses on social manners and class structure within a fantasy setting. It often emphasizes dialogue and social intrigue over action or magic, drawing parallels with historical periods of strict social norms. Gaslamp Fantasy. Similar to steampunk, this genre is set in a Victorian or Edwardian era, but incorporates magical elements. It often explores alternate histories where magic plays a role in society and technology. Gothic Fantasy. Combines elements of Gothic horror with fantasy. It features dark, often brooding settings, supernatural elements, and a sense of romanticism and mystery. Grimdark. A subgenre characterized by a particularly dark, grim, and morally ambiguous world. Characters are often anti-heroes, and the narrative may involve significant violence and complex, mature themes. Hard fantasy. Emphasizes realistic and logical consistency in its magical elements. It's akin to hard science fiction, but focuses on magic and fantasy, creating a world where magic follows specific, often scientific-like rules. High fantasy. Set in an entirely fictional world, high fantasy involves epic stories of good versus evil. It often features elaborate world building, complex lore, and a focus on grand quests or battles. Historical fantasy blends elements of fantasy with historical settings. It incorporates magic or mythical beings into real historical periods, creating an alternate version of history. Isekai, a Japanese genre involving characters being transported to, reborn, or trapped in a parallel universe or a fantasy world. It often explores themes of escapism and adventure in a new world. Oftentimes, the other world features magic systems that take the form similar to that of a video game or an RPG system. Juvenile Fantasy. Aimed at younger audiences, these stories often involve children or teenagers and are characterized by less complex themes and narratives, focusing more on adventure and discovery. Low Fantasy. Set in a realistic world with minimal magical elements, the fantastical aspects are downplayed, creating a subtle contrast with the otherwise mundane setting. Magic Realism. Blends magical elements with a realistic setting, often without explanation. It focuses on the seamless integration of the extraordinary into the ordinary world. Mythic Fantasy. Centers around myths and legends, often reinterpreting or expanding upon traditional mythological tales with added depth and originality. Can often be used to expand upon a mythical character's personality or the relationship between characters of the same myth. Mythopoeia. Involves creating detailed and complex mythologies and legendary histories for fictional worlds. It often involves a deep level of world building, with its own languages, races, and histories. Mythpunk. Combines elements of mythology with punk sensibilities. It often involves subverting traditional myths, featuring non-traditional characters and settings. Romantic Fantasy. Focuses on romance within a fantasy setting. It often involves fantastical elements intertwined with a love story, exploring the relationship between characters in a world of magic and adventure. Science Fantasy. Blends elements of science fiction and fantasy, often featuring advanced technology alongside magical elements. It creates worlds where both science and magic coexist and interact. Dying Earth. Set in a far future where the Earth is dying or vastly changed, it often combines elements of science fiction and fantasy, focusing on the decline of civilization, magic, and technology in a decaying world. Planetary Romance. Focuses on adventure and romance on other planets, often blending elements of science fiction and fantasy. It typically features exotic alien landscapes and cultures with an emphasis on personal adventure and exploration. Sword and Planet. A blend of science fiction and fantasy set on other planets, featuring sword-wielding heroes in high adventure. It often includes elements of planetary romance and swashbuckling action. Superhero Fantasy. Involves characters with superhuman abilities or powers. Often set in modern or futuristic worlds, these stories focus on the struggles and responsibilities of being a superhero. Supernatural Fantasy. Involves elements of the supernatural, such as ghosts, spirits, and otherworldly beings. It often explores the interaction between the natural and supernatural realms. Shenmo. A genre of Chinese fiction involving gods and demons, often based on Chinese mythology and religious beliefs. It typically features fantastic adventures and moral lessons. Weird Fiction. A genre blending horror, science fiction, and fantasy. It often involves bizarre, otherworldly, and uncanny elements, creating a sense of unease and the unknown. New Weird. A modern evolution of weird fiction, often blending elements of fantasy, horror, and speculative fiction. It emphasizes complex characters and settings with a focus on subverting traditional genre tropes. Weird West. A hybrid of Western with other genres, typically horror, science fiction, or fantasy. It often features anachronistic technology, supernatural elements, and alternative history scenarios set in the American frontier.